This is Alina Powell, and today I'll be reading my 2.3.9 speech. So let's get started. Picture this. You are an African American citizen that was just freed from slavery after the Civil War, only to then face heavy discrimination and mistreatment for decades, all because of the color of your skin. For this reason alone, I will be discussing in today's speech the discrimination that the African American community has had to face in America. African Americans were discriminated against due to the color of their skin, eventually leading to the Civil Rights Movement. They would often be denied their right to vote, segregated by race, and even had to face an increased amount of racially motivated violence. Let me illustrate this for you by going into more detail about these discriminations. Firstly, African Americans were often denied their right to vote. African Americans were not allowed to vote because of the color of their skin. This is called voter suppression, done to eliminate the Black community from voting. This is essentially removing their only voice in our nation, deeming them as second-class citizens under the law. Voter suppression is a form of racial injustice. Anytime a person is denied their constitutional rights based upon the color of their skin, racial injustice has occurred, according to Ben Crump, a lawyer in racial injustice. Secondly, the African American community was segregated by race, separated from their white counterparts in public. In both northern and southern states, African Americans were segregated. Often things like public transportation, schools, prisons, and public accommodations were segregated, according to the LOG. They would often have the worst version of these public accommodations in places, once again deeming them as second-class citizens compared to their white counterparts. Lastly, African Americans also face an increased amount of racially motivated violence. During this time, there was a widespread epidemic of racially motivated violence. Beatings and lynchings would often happen to the African American community by white supremacy groups like the KKK. With more than 581 lynchings reported in Mississippi and 531 reported lynchings in Georgia, according to the NAACP. The African American community faced an increased amount of police brutalities and fatalities compared to other races, according to the Center of Juvenile and Criminal Justice. And it says, see the chart below. So right here is the chart for that. Law enforcement would also often be seen beating Black peaceful protesters because of the color of their skin. And then these are the pictures that it says to see below, that one and that one. In conclusion, African Americans have had to deal with the denial of their right to vote, segregation by race, and increased amounts of racially motivated violence for decades, leading me to touch on the discrimination that the African American community often had to face regularly. The discrimination caused by the color of their skin eventually led the Black community enforcing the Civil Rights Movement. The racial discrimination was a very unfair treatment for the African American citizens that had already had to deal with the experience the hardships of slavery, only to then be mistreated and discriminated against, furthermore to come. And that's the end of my speech.